Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Western Caucus Foundation DC Connect Roundtable. We do these DC Connects so we can bring Washington and connect them with the rest of the country and Western and rural America. So we have a lot of folks coming into us on our live stream that we have broadcasting right now. And this will be up, and you'll see this on our website as well. So we really like to expand the audience, not just have it inside DC here, but really reach people across Western and rural America. So today we're talking about affordable and reliable American energy. Obviously, we've had the energy renaissance over the past 10 years, and now we're at a point where the federal government is trying to inhibit and impede affordable and reliable energy development in the United States. So that's what we're here to talk about today. And with that, I want to introduce the chairwoman of the Senate Western Caucus to kick us off, Senator Cynthia Lummis from Wyoming.
Daryl, thank you so much, and thanks for all the Western Caucus Foundation does. It's an important group because you are sharing the message of what the Western states can do to unleash American energy, jobs, revenue, priorities, independence from the rest of the world on energy. We can be the leader, the driver, the nation that is #1 in the world in energy independence, and thereby help free the world from the shackles of governments that are autocratic. I am so pleased we're doing this in a way that allows people to participate here in Washington and also around the West, and we have a wonderful panel as well as many experts that are listening. So share your thoughts with us. We'll put them up on the Western Caucus website, and we're delighted you are here. So one of the most important goals of the Senate Western Caucus is to promote energy independence. And of course, this is music to the ears of my state. State of Wyoming is #1 in coal, #8 in oil, and #9 in natural gas in the nation. That makes us #3 overall in the production of energy here in the United States. So I'm proud of Wyoming's great contribution to powering the nation and to making our country even more secure in a very dangerous world. But we can do more. We know we can, and we were doing it. We were doing it before. And then along came an administration that was hostile to American energy independence, hostile to the great work we were doing. On day one, President Biden not only shut down the Keystone Pipeline, but halted new oil and gas leasing on public lands. Half of my state is public lands, and more than half of the energy that comes from my state is off of public land. So this was a dramatic blow to our nation's ability to produce its own energy and to help our allies around the world with their energy needs. Destroying domestic coal production only leads to an increase in production of dirty Chinese coal. We see it in their air. They shut it down during the Olympic Games and the air cleared up in Beijing. It is not a priority for them. And all of their protestations to the contrary, it is a nation that doesn't care about global carbon emissions. They care about world domination. The Biden administration also has been antagonistic towards Wyoming coal. It's delaying its permits for the Black Butte coal mine in Wyoming, again, another coal mine that is on federal land. Then we see the United States go to OPEC and beg for an increase in oil production. We see the Biden administration lift sanctions on Venezuela, allowing their oil and gas to replace what we can produce, cleaner, safer, on American soil. So the Western Caucus will be the voice of reason on this issue. I want to point out how Senator Dan Sullivan of Alaska and Senator Kevin Cramer of North Dakota have been relentless advocates and allies on putting together a strategy for a time when America is ready to once again unleash American energy and resume its place as the world energy leader. So we'll continue to push our message that domestic production is the only path forward. I want to thank everyone on the panel today for their participation and the work they do across the country. I want to thank all of you for keeping this issue front and center in its importance in our nation's national security. So thank you again, Darren, for your great work, and thank you for allowing me to kick off this terrific conversation. Thanks again.
Thank you, Senator. And if we can now have our panelists come up and join us. We have a great panel group of folks today. We'll be led by Andrew Williams, who is the Executive Director of the Senate Western Caucus for Chair Lummis. And we have, all the way from Alaska, we have DC and a think tank. So I'll let Andrew do the introductions here.
Appreciate you all being here today, and thanks to Senator Lummis, the vet off on Capitol Hill, for those remarks. So I'll just go over and introduce everybody on the table. At the far end here, we have Mayor Josiah Patkotak from the North Slope community of Borough, Alaska. And I am looking forward to talking to you about the oil and gas leases in the Arctic. We have Dustin Meyer, the Senior Vice President of Policy, Economics, and Regulatory Affairs at API. And we have next to me here Kate Farr from Occidental Petroleum. Kate is a superstar when it comes to these issues, a former ENR staffer. And we have Kenny Stein, Vice President for Policy at the Institute for Energy Research. So thank you all for being here today. And like I said, let's start with the Alaska cancellation of those leases. Mr. Mayor, can you speak to how that affects your communities and go from there?
Thank you, Andrew. One of the, I think, 5 Andrews I've met today. So good start. As you mentioned, I reassured him before we came up here so he doesn't grill me as hard. So as he mentioned, I'm the newly elected mayor of the North Slope Borough, which is essentially, if you look at the map of Alaska, our jurisdiction is everything north of the Brooks Range, which has been our kind of traditional border for the lands that we've occupied, traversed, and pretty much owned and operated on for the last hundreds of years. And so in regards to the cancellation or the new rules that are coming out in regards to ANWR and NPRA. So essentially NPRA is the left half of my borough. And it has a long-standing promise, actually 100 years this year, in regards to the 1923 original act signed by President Harding that said that the federal government is going to look to producing what we had in our barren wasteland. Essentially, is how it was described. And over the years, it's had its economic upswings, downswings. I know that one of the jobs my grandpa talked about in the 50s was working for the Dew Line site and whatever exploratory drilling they were doing. And the idea that what we were happy with at the point was just being able to have a job, right? And provide for your family and the pride that's associated with being able to do that. We come from a traditionally subsistence background, right? My family's been participating in the cultural traditional whale hunt, bowhead whale hunt for as long as we can remember. And the pride associated with that kind of correlates with the pride of being able to provide for your family, your community, and your region. And so you fast forward a little bit to I guess, discovery of oil, right? We knew it was there. We were already burning it in our sod. And, the traditional idea of in the summertime, you go cut up all the oil-stricken sod and then you stack it up and pull it out on a sled in the wintertime to warm your house. So the discovery happened, right, in the late 60s, and then we stood up our different organizations, whether it was our Aullaqsruaq village corporations and regional corporations or our borough. And so I think it's important to give the context of which is culminating to today's argument that we're not asking for we're not asking for a handout, we're asking for a hand up kind of thing. We want to be able to participate in helping provide for the nation, helping provide for the state, and ultimately helping provide for ourselves. So I can go into plenty more detail. I don't know how much time we have scheduled today, but that's essentially the cliff notes of the history of NPRA oil production and ANWR in the state. So.
Well, thank you. And you're right, we do have a lot to get to, but I do want to ask you a follow-up. Can you kind of share how this will affect your economy?
Absolutely. So North Slope Borough was stood up in 1972. We actually had to appeal to the state Supreme Court to make sure that, you know, we had the rights that we were asking for. So we're a first-class home rule government within the state of Alaska, and we're second to the state of Alaska. We're probably the what I like to think the strongest, most effective government within Alaska. And so we have, as I mentioned before, a jurisdiction north of the Brooks Range. We have an ad valorem tax that we levy on the assessed value of anything north. And so currently, well, a little more backstory to that, right? The reason that we stood up the borough was because the first oil sale, lease sale that happened in, I believe, 1969, not a penny went to what we were doing in the Arctic Slope and in the North Slope. And so we said, how do we make sure that A, we have the influence that we need to make sure that we can steer the production of our homelands, right? I mean, one of the cool stories I like remembering is my grandma growing up in the pre-May oil fields and getting scolded by her mother for playing in the mud, right? And you got to go clean the black mud off your boots now because you're playing in there. So knock that off. And that was the crude oil sitting on the tundra. And so we had to figure out a way to make either side listen, right? Whether it was the left or the right wing of the bird. But we had to force them to listen to us in some way. And that's where we stood up the borough. Get the taxing authority, get our permitting authority in place so that we could steer the conversations. One of the things I like to brag about in regards to our, you know, we say we got the most strict and buckled down guidelines when it comes to oil and gas production in the Arctic. And really it's should be a testament and a model for anyone doing oil and gas production in the Arctic across the globe. But the thing that I like to just highlight, right, is that oil and gas companies came in, make this Trans-Alaska pipeline, and they want to pump hundreds of millions of barrels of oil, and that's fine. And they make it, you know, about 5 feet high, so you can walk right up to it, bring your welding leads, and do whatever you need to do right there. And we said, our caribou with their antlers, they ain't going to make it under that, and they ain't going to make it over that. And so part of that process was you need to elevate the Trans-Alaska pipeline. And it's those examples that show that all we want to do is make sure that at least our perception of what we have to deal with, whether it's a subsistence aspect or the economical aspect, are met. And so going into the economics of it, right? So we have a $22 billion assessed value across the North Slope, spits out through the tax formula with the state of Alaska, and our mill rate spits out about $400 million in operating budget. We have a limit that we haven't gotten close to reaching on a GeoBond capital budget basis. And we actually just sold about $98 million in general obligation bonds last week. And so together it comes to about $500 million annually that we have to put to work for our people. But I say that with a grain of salt, right? Because as I mentioned before, the North Slope Borough is unlike any other municipality. So when you wake up in the morning and, you know, the lights are on and the heat's on, right? That's electricity, that's natural gas in some villages, it's diesel in the other villages. You go outside to start your car, and then you're going to drive to work, but you get stuck in the snow drift. So the public works department is going to come and clear the snow and pull you out. You take your lunch break, you go and flush the toilet. We own and operate the water sewer system. We own and operate the roads and waterways. We do our own power generation in 7 of our 8 villages. And so the responsibility for us to provide these services to our residents is unlike any other municipality I've been to every municipality in the nation, but I would like to say that it's unlike any municipality in the nation. I know it is unlike any municipality in the state. And so anything from trash, anything from mental health services. We don't have hospitals in every community. None of our communities are connected by roads. So if you have a serious injury, you're either going to have to wait for the next commercial flight, which is in a little plane, or you can call the North Slope Borough if it's serious enough, and we'll send one of our rescue aircraft out there because we operate the search and rescue program. We're real close with the state of Alaska and the FAA to make sure that we're up to par on all of that kind of stuff. And so, as I say, unlike any other, there's no other higher demand on a municipality than there is on the North Slope Borough. And so, though the $500 million in an annual budget sounds like a lot, it doesn't go very far when you've got, I think it's 350 miles across to be able to service, and then another 150 miles north to south. And so, along with that, we've taken a long-range stance on what oil and gas development means, and the idea that it maybe won't last forever, right? And so we've kind of stood up our own rainy day fund, which is real similar to any other countries or states sovereign wealth fund, essentially. And so that spits out a little bit of an interest that we can tap into if needed. And so, yeah, I guess the demand that's placed on us, we're always looking for ways to find efficiencies, but we're always looking for ways to partner with the opportunity for growth. And I mean, just the aspect of roads alone, right? Any road that we're able to get kind of in conjunction with oil and gas development, because we make sure that we can use that road as kind of a local public use option. Just that alone, right? Where you're talking about 1.1 or $1.7 million a mile for gravel infrastructure, where the federal government's not going to be there to put the roads in for us, but oil and gas is willing to be a partner in that. And so just that aspect alone, right? And to put a little context, Prudhoe Bay, to where I was born and raised in Borough, we operate a snow trail in the wintertime, and that's about 210 miles. And so you can imagine right off the bat, just to connect one community to the rest of the state of Alaska via road is $250 million all day long. And so it's those kind of opportunities that if we don't have the right to our resource is going to be essentially flushed down the toilet. And I say rights to our resources on both fronts, because it's not just oil and gas, but we see the restrictions on our bowhead whaling, we see the restrictions on our terrestrial game, we see the use of they did it with the polar bears back in 2009. It was something about the first 2 miles of the coastline is critical habitat, right? We see all these different attacks on just our ability to access the things that are in our backyard, whether it's an animal or whether it's the resource under our feet. And so, yeah, just a little bit of the borough's work ahead of us. So.
Well, thank you for that. And you know, in the lower 48, we're seeing similar actions, shutting down oil and gas leases. So I kind of want to talk to Kenny. Can you speak to the resources we have in the ground, and do we have what it takes to be energy independent again?
Sure, of course. Obviously, we need to define what we mean by energy independent. Sure. I tend to say energy secure because ultimately there's a global market for especially oil. But the resources we have in the ground, whether it's coal, gas, oil, these are hundreds of years worth of known reserves that we already have. And there's a lot, and those are just the proved reserves. But when you talk about, there's even more resources below the ground that are just waiting to be unlocked by technological advancements, the way that shale has been. So there is no question of not having enough of these resources domestically, lower 48 and Alaska. Sure.
So aside from a willing administration, what would it take? And we can kind of parlay this into permitting reform too. Sure. And we'll open it up to anybody who wants to answer that. Is, Congress obviously took a first stab, if you will, at permitting reform a few months ago. But obviously more needs to be done. So starting with you, Kenny, what is the top priority you think is for the industry, or what should it be?
Well, I mean, it's sort of the main, is the obvious one, is really true reform to NEPA.
Yeah.
But I'd also say, just as in the process of this permitting discussion, it's making sure that we're not giving away the store and not getting something in exchange. So right now, the wind and solar industries need an enormous amount of transmission in order to make their industry viable. They need permitting reform to make that happen. So that they have to come to the table. And I think it's important for everyone else, oil, gas, coal, anybody, highways, anybody, to get something in return and not just give them a free range.
Katie, do you want to hit or Dustin, excuse me? Yeah, anything?
I might actually. I think that, you know, the minor steps and progress that was made in the FRA, I think those are important in their own right. But I also think the very notion that there were components of permitting reform that were part of that conversation is indicative of just what this growing recognition is across all corners of our society, which is, it is exceedingly difficult to build anything in the United States right now, and that is particularly true for large-scale energy projects. We, our component of the industry, our part of the value chain, has been confronted with this and dealing with this for the better part of the last 15 years, so this is not surprising to us. I do think that some of our friends on the renewable side or on the transmission side, they're a little bit newer to it, and they're starting to experience the exact same sorts of obstacles that we've been confronted with for so long. That is, in theory at least, the foundation of truly bipartisan, sensible, meaningful reforms to our very broken permitting process. So I think that the FRA provided some small steps, but there's another big bite that needs to be taken, and there's going to have to be a lot of components. But I do think, at least in theory, the ingredients are there for a deal.
So that's interesting that you mentioned, both of you, renewable energy. And I think you're right. I think a lot of folks thought that, you know, some of these groups would stop suing once they realize you're putting renewable energy on the ground. And Senator Cassidy has a wonderful bill, the Repair Act, which would essentially eliminate, not judicial review. I don't want to say it the wrong way, but it would stop frivolous lawsuits. And Kate, can you speak to that at all, to these lawsuits under NEPA and how they affect the process?
No, certainly. Certainly, I think that is a major headwind that our industry faces. At Oxy, we have a lot of federal acreage, both onshore and offshore. And, you know, we see just about every lease sale tied up in some sort of litigation. So in this conversation about permitting reform, I think the judicial review piece is absolutely essential. You know, and to back up a little bit, you know, we see these major policy swings from administration to administration. And one of the best ways to prevent that and provide certainty to the industry is to, you know, to reform the text, to reform the language. And that's Congress's job. I know it's easier said than done, but certainly worth it. So yeah, so I would say it's a major point for us.
So, and maybe it's a question for me, but what is the path forward here in Congress? Does anybody, is there light at the end of the tunnel from the outside? Do you see it? Or, because from my perspective, things seem to have kind of quieted down a little bit, feeling a little down in the dumps.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Well, so for me personally, just given what I said about not giving away the store, I actually don't mind things have died down a little bit, because I'm concerned that anything that this administration would agree to would not be nearly enough. So, you know, I think it's important to continue those negotiations and talk about what people can agree on. And I do think it probably needs to wait for a different administration before I think you can have real movement, or at least movement that we'd want, I guess.
Yeah, I think it is important to be clear-eyed about the, you know, prospects. I think that indicative of that, or as evidence to some of those concerns, you know, we did make these small steps with an FRA bipartisan appeal to that, right? That's a good thing. But what happened shortly thereafter, if you look at the details of the administration's proposals under NEPA Phase 2, they go exactly counter to that legislation that was passed just a couple of months ago, right? That's designed to make it easier to get projects permitted, and then they establish a proposal that's going to make things more difficult to get permitted. So that's, again, a piece of evidence as to why the window will be open someday, but I'm not quite sure that it's open right now.
Anybody want to add anything else on permitting reform?
Yeah, I guess I would just say, right, one of the things that, so formerly before becoming mayor, I was serving in the state legislature, was able to chair the resources committee in the House. Most recently was the whip in the majority. And one of the things that we were pushing as far as taking primacy over Section 404, and specific to the North Slope, where, you know, almost 80% of our land is considered wetland. Just understanding from a federal level that it's not a one-size-fits-all approach, because if you have land, you know, stipulations that may cover only a small percentage of whatever your area of influence is, when you get to somewhere like the North Slope, all we are is wetland. And so when you make a wetland determination, that's how we eat, sleep, and breathe. And so just saying that, you know, it's not a one-size-fits-all approach, especially for us up north. So.
Understood. Thanks for that perspective too. And I guess we'll turn to the Endangered Species Act, everybody's favorite topic. The Endangered Species Act continues to, in my view, be a thorn in the side of energy production with little to no benefit to species. And we've seen the Congressional Western Caucus take the lead in formulating some reforms to that. And Senator Lummis is very interested in those conversations too. And the Biden administration recently announced it's rolling back 3 Trump-era reforms that did add greater flexibility to the ESA. So from your all's perspective, how are these rollbacks going to affect the energy production domestically? Anyone want to take that one? I'll start calling them.
I guess, yeah, I'll just throw out just as a starting point. I mean, the Trump efforts were steps in the right direction, but they happened so recently that I don't know that on the ground they had started to make any difference yet. So rolling them back right now, I'm not sure you're going to see a huge impact. But to the extent that production on federal lands was already difficult, and when a company like Oxy is deciding where to invest money, anything you do to make it harder to produce on federal lands is going to make it less likely they're going to invest somewhere else, because there's other places to invest.
Yeah. Well, and more specifically, sage grouse, right, is huge in the West, and every year, obviously, fighting. We get the sage grouse rider and barring the use of funds for a listing. And how devastating would a sage grouse listing be on the industry, Kate?
No, I think a sage grouse listing would be very, very challenging and make it very difficult to develop and continue to operate in the West. I think, it would be very disappointing, of course, because of all the great work that states have done, particularly in Wyoming. There's been a lot of great coordination between governor's offices, industry folks, NGOs. And, in Wyoming, we have the sage grouse implementation team, CIGIT, and that really brought together a lot of different folks and voices, and they provide good management recommendations. So, if the administration were just to list the bird, then we would be ignoring all that good work that incorporates the, very productive and effective on the ground technologies.
Yeah, I think that's what's become so interesting about this space, right? Is that no one out there is saying that, these species shouldn't be protected or that the habitat shouldn't be considered as you develop your projects and infrastructure. It's just what's the best way to do it. And right now you start to see more and more evidence of these collaborative approaches, often state-driven approaches that are just on the ground more effective at the stated goal than what the federal government listing process is. So how can that really continue to be ignored by the administration? I think that's a real challenge.
Yeah, and I guess if I can chime in, the North Slope Borough does run a wildlife department where we take the initiative to make sure we research all the different animals that are that we hunt and eat, because we've had a long-standing fight with the federal government in regards to the access to our animals. Right, we saw the whole. It's almost like the assumption that they're endangered before there's any research on the fact of whether or not they are. Right, we went through this with the bowhead whale and our right to hunt, and numerous times since that happened in 1978 have we gone through the different animals that we hunt and eat. Sure, their tactic may be specific to trying to list critical habitat and shut down any kind of development, but alongside that, you're actually working towards, and we've made this argument, working towards trying to kill our culture and kill our traditions. I mean, we have this old saying up north, and it's polar bears are good with ketchup. So
Well, and so on that, so related to what you said, Mr. Mayor, and to the sage grouse, and just showing, are these collaborative efforts, should these be the basis for ESA reform? Because it seems that what Wyoming is doing with the sage grouse and how your communities are managing your wildlife seems to be working, right? But when an animal is listed on the endangered species list, that's what, a 2% recovery rate?
yeah, I think I'm not familiar with the specific rollbacks that y'all are referring to, but I think the general idea for that we ask for is that we've been actively studying, monitoring all of our animals, paying for it out of pocket in a lot of instances. Mainly because of the subsistence aspect. We don't want our rights to be taken away to be able to hunt these animals. And so I think some of that collaboration from the federal government with the entities, boots on the ground that are familiar with that area, that know what they're doing, and then taking that, because we do it from the borough standpoint, we do it unbiased, right? It's not because we want to have whatever development happen. It's because we care about the animal, because I mean, that's what's kept us alive for a number of years. And so, yeah, I would just say in respect to, again, it goes back to kind of the 404 primacy stuff, right? One size does not fit all. And I think the federal government needs to take that approach when it comes to different regulatory matters. So.
Well, and on that note, so we'll does anybody have anything else to add on endangered species? I can go with that. You know, under the Biden administration, we've seen the rollout of this conservation rule. You know, under FLTMA, the multiple use and sustained yield mandate is the law of the land. And now we're kind of seeing administration want to come in and say, well, conservation could be part of that, potentially locking lands up from development, from grazing, from recreation. And who wants this one? I guess we'll go to you. Do you want to talk about how this proposal would affect energy development?
Yeah, I mean, on one hand, it's kind of an interesting concept, right? That you're establishing conservation as another use case under this program. I think a lot remains to be seen, and that was one of the very acute problems that we had with the proposal, is just the sheer lack of any level of detail as to how this would be implemented and how it would be designed. And whenever you have that gap, that absence of detail, it is almost naturally filled with subjectivity, right? And I think that granting that subjectivity to administration as to which parts of any different particular federal parcel are going to be included for this use case or this use case, and how those use cases compare to each other, is a recipe for uncertainty and confusion and politicizing the resource development on these acres that is in the statute. That's what these acres are for. So I think that's really where the concern is that the lack of detail gives this administration or future administration the option to politicize our onshore leasing of federal lands.
No. Very
Yeah,
well put.
and I'll just say including conservation as part of this discussion, that's a reasonable proposal, but we need to change the law to do that. Like this is not something that can be done unilaterally. This is something Congress needs to discuss this. There's a reason why any sort of wilderness designation or national park designation has extensive debate in Congress to determine how much use will be allowed in that wilderness in order for it to be approved. Congress clearly wants to be part of this discussion, and the administration is now trying to cut out Congress entirely from these discussions of what level of conservation is appropriate.
Which is such a common theme across so many of the rulemakings from this administration, right? Is they're unprecedented. When you keep doing things that are unprecedented, oftentimes, well, there's a reason why no one else did it before, because the statute doesn't allow it. So.
No, and I agree with that. I think, if you have BLM who's unilaterally essentially adding to the list of major uses, where does it end? Everything is going to be a major use, and that could render FLTMA moot eventually. And I'd also note that BLM and DOI, they have the authority to practice conservation. We're seeing that for things like the Rock Springs RMP. So yeah, I think that's a major concern for our company as well.
Well, thanks for bringing up the RMP. I think we're seeing a lot of resource management plans kind of shifting into this new use of ACECs in areas of critical environmental concern. And in Rock Springs draft plan, I think it's 1.8 million of the 3.6 million acres are going to be ACECs, essentially cut off from all development, all use. And luckily, I think there's been some pushback bipartisan in the state that is kind of changing their tack, knock on wood. But you know, are these affecting Oxy and other RMPs that you're following? Or are they just coming from Wyoming?
Well, no, I mean, I think it's definitely of concern. This is one of the most aggressive we've seen. It's something that, you know, we're watching. Maybe this is something of, you know, a test case for BLM.
Yeah.
And, you know, they are putting it out there to see kind of what the pushback will be. But, you know, as we noted, it's definitely a tool in their toolkit and something that, you know, the industry, Oxy, but the industry as a whole is aware of and needs to follow closely.
All right, we were down to the EPA's Clean Power Plan 2.0. So I think we're a lot of production focused here, but that's still very important. You know, it mandates most coal and gas fired power plants to eliminate almost all carbon dioxide emissions in 15 years. This will obviously have a huge effect on the energy market. I would assume it's going to raise prices at pump, when you're paying your energy bill. You want to speak to that?
Yeah, I can do so. So the power plant rule is another example of an unprecedented proposal from the administration. I think taking a little bit of a step back to remind folks as to what this administration's vision is, the power plant rule is a very important part of it because really, and perhaps the first part of it, and that is to fully decarbonize the U.S. power sector as quickly as possible, and then electrify everything else on top of it, right? And so when you factor in the EPA's tailpipe or CAFE rules for internal combustion engine bans, that's part and parcel of this overall vision. And so they put forward this proposal, and the timing of it is interesting, right? Because already in the United States, going into every summer and going into every winter, there is a growing level of concern about the reliability of our electricity grid. And a lot of that is driven by the premature preliminary retirement of a lot of the traditional baseload resources, right? This rule, unfortunately, is going to probably accelerate that trend. It is very difficult if you're a utility or an independent power producer out there right now to look at this rule and think, oh, this is a good time to invest in a new gas plant or a new coal plant, right? Now, there remain, as is true for a lot of the proposals out there, significant legal vulnerabilities to this rule. And a lot of those vulnerabilities were addressed in the comment period. But between now and when there's any sort of judicial review of this rule is a long time. And during that time, it is going to be an empty moment for new investment in the sorts of grid resources that we really need to maintain reliability and keep costs down. So it's kind of a scary proposal at an already scary time. Some of the technologies that really hinges on, which would be carbon capture technology, hydrogen technology, very promising, right? Industry fully supports that, but the timelines in question are just really unrealistic. And you think about the amount of infrastructure that you would need to get anywhere close, and then factor in the challenges that we have building that infrastructure, and it just starts to look really unrealistic.
Yeah, I'd just say the second clean power plan is really, it's the flip side of the subsidies in the Inflation Reduction Act. They tried to get these mandates passed by Congress, and they were dropped for a reason, because they couldn't get a majority in the Congress to actually pass it. So this is the flip side, because again, especially wind, solar, and especially batteries are not affordable in a free market. Both coal and natural gas and nuclear, for that matter, are going to outcompete them. So you, on the one side, you've got the IRA subsidies, but the clean power plan is an important flip side, because just subsidizing wind and solar and batteries isn't enough to change over the entire electricity grid. You also have to destroy the existing grid in order to get there. So it's two sides of the same coin.
And you can start almost already to see the flaw in this logic, right? If you look at what's happening to the offshore wind industry right now and the challenges that they're experiencing, even getting a modest amount of capacity online on any sort of reasonable timeline or at any reasonable cost, you can see that's the exposure that you have if you're driving out the reliable sources right now and banking on these future technologies being there, but then they get delayed. That gap is where reliability falls apart. That's where cost falls apart, and consumers will ultimately pay the brunt of it.
Well, yeah, just another, and just an additional thing onto that, in the Clean Power Plan, especially with carbon capture, the way they suppose that they can mandate these carbon capture things onto coal and natural gas is they say, well, the IRA is subsidizing, therefore it will be cost effective to do it. They don't actually like calculate anything, and they don't consider the fact that, well, maybe some of these subsidies will be repealed or what have you. It's just assumed that in the future there will be technology that exists to do this. Therefore, we are going to. Very interesting way to think.
I guess I'll just say, you know, how we're able to react to the messaging from the state level, right? I mean, we just went through a year, and it'll be another year or so trying to get our state house in order and our laws in place to even factor in carbon offset or carbon sequestration. And this kind of stuff just doesn't happen overnight. And as far as the cost per kilowatt hour and all of that, you know, when I talk to the Department of Energy, I tell them, okay, you want to go to green energy. I still got honey buckets. I still power generate off diesel. Let's go to greener energy, right? Like I'm all for it. Like Borough, where I'm born and raised, we power off natural gas. Nuts recently, because of the development in Alpine, I think back in 2008, now powers off natural gas. And it's so how do we look at other opportunities where we can work with, again, that create that synergy and that partnership with industry where, right, they want to pursue it for the marketability globally. But in the same breath, let's knock out some of these local power generation issues. And I guess just taking that specific, you got to take things by case basis. Where there's opportunities, you strike that opportunity. But I guess that's where I'm at.
Absolutely, thank you. And you mentioned carbon sequestration, and I guess just an open-ended question: how viable is carbon sequestration?
So I do know for the North Slope, from the state's perspective, it is pretty viable. I mean, all of industry. I don't think there are any exceptions. Our Alaska Oil and Gas Association, Resource Development Council, and the like have signed off on their essential endorsement of carbon sequestration. And as I said, we're putting the guidelines in place. Because it's still treated as a Class 6 well, you're still going through all of that regulatory rigmarole. And we're just finally getting to a point where through the policies and through our laws, we can facilitate carbon sequestration. And so what kind of reality that brings, I don't know, but it does, it's a testament to the fact that we want to work with you on what these strides towards those things are, so.
No, and I would say, it absolutely is viable. It's something that, as an oil and gas company, we know the geology of the reservoirs. We know, how to get the product out, and we can map out, all of the pore space, things like that. And so we know we can, do it. We also have been doing it for some time through enhanced oil recovery, which is where you take carbon dioxide and inject it into a producing reservoir to flush out the remaining hydrocarbons. And then that has the added benefit of, permanently storing the CO2 in that formation. So Oxy has a number of carbon sequestration projects, mostly around the Gulf region, but it's something that, we're excited about and take very seriously.
Just to piggyback off that, she brings up the key point and problem with carbon sequestration is that you need a marketable use for that CO2 in order to get people to make it worth it. Right now, the only, other than some enhanced oil recovery, there's really not much use for whatever you're storing. So the only incentive is government. So as long as the dominant incentive for carbon capture is government, it's always going to struggle to take off. And you're not going to, it's going to be hard for people to innovate and find better ways to do it because they don't, literally the only incentive is compliance. It's not, you're not, there needs to be a way to make money.
value.
Yes, right.
Yeah, it's helpful. You mentioned offshore, so I think we'll end with a question on the offshore here. The proposed outer continental shelf oil and gas leasing program for the next 5 years mandates 3 lease sales till 2029. It's 8 fewer than under the previous administration. We've also seen in the Gulf the Rice's whale issue, where it seems to be nothing more than a backhanded attempt to end oil and gas development. So does anybody want to speak to how that will affect production nationwide or in the Gulf specifically?
I can jump and start. I mean, I think that the 5-year leasing program, which they put out last month after a lengthy delay and very begrudgingly, was very disappointing. The fewest lease sales ever offered in a 5-year program. And I think a lot of folks recognize and expect that even getting some of those lease sales actually to happen is going to be a challenge. I think what underpins it, and this is what's frustrating through so much of this administration's perspective on energy policy, is just a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of energy demand and the nature of oil demand and gas demand specifically. So often the conversation around the world proceeds as if we're already past peak oil demand and demand is plummeting rapidly as the world rapidly shifts and transitions to electric vehicles. Nothing could be further from the case. As we sit here today, global oil demand is at a record high. Next year, it's expected to be another record high. And every year going out to at least 2028 is likely to be a record high. So once you start to understand that, then the question becomes, all right, where's the supply going to come from?
Yep.
You know, we, and I presume most people in this room, strongly believe that that supply should come from the United States. The administration, I think, has this misguided belief that they think demand is plummeting. And therefore, you don't need these long lead time sort of supply sources, which offshore oil and gas is. And so I think that's the flawed premise of a lot of their policy making. And I think there's probably fewer, clearer examples of that than the offshore leasing program.
No, it's hugely disappointing, as you mentioned, and I agree with everything you've said. Oxy is the 4th largest oil and gas producer in the Gulf. We have 10 platforms, more than anybody else. It's a huge part of our business. And as you mentioned, it takes roughly 10 years from leasing to production in the offshore. That's, you know, a lot of time, a lot of money to plan, and having such a restrictive and slim schedule is, you know, makes you wonder where we're going to be in the next 10 years from now. So, you know, we don't know what our energy needs will be domestically. We don't know what geopolitical situation we'll find ourselves in. And, you know, it's just always better to have that, that tool there in the toolkit. I'd also say too that offshore production is huge for local economies, huge for the local communities, and much of the revenue that the industry, you know, generates in terms of the lease sales and bonus bids and royalties go back to the states for things like conservation, and that's, you know, something that we're really proud of. And if you don't have that source of revenue, will it follow the taxpayer? I don't want to ask.
A really good point. If you don't have that revenue, you're not funding our national parks through the Great American Outdoors Act. You're not funding LWCF, right? Those are all points that are very near and dear to Senator Lummis. She loves to talk about that. So,
And just adding, I'll go back to something I said earlier about these companies have other places they can invest.
yeah,
So that's the, you know, the plan itself, you know, sure, how much will be leased, we can't really say, but as setting expectations,
Yeah.
it makes companies not want to bid. It makes companies, you know, Exxon is developing offshore in Guyana, not in the United States, because of that kind of service, that looking forward. And also, I'll add, the Biden administration always complains about gas prices and high oil prices. And then they turn around and say, oh, well, the offshore won't do anything for that because it takes so long to build it. But the problem is that oil prices are set by expectations. It's all the crude oil prices globally are set looking forward. And so when you say for the next 5 years, we're not going to allow any more offshore development, that drives up oil prices. The mere announcement of that drives up oil prices. So I mean, obviously they have a political problem here that their green goals conflict with on the ground reality at the gas pump. But it's important to point that out.
And for what it's worth, I mean, it's widely recognized out there that US offshore barrels are among, if not the lowest carbon intensity barrels on the global market. So again, if you understand that demand is going to be there, where is the supply going to come from? Well, it should probably come from the cleanest sources. It should probably come from domestic sources. That's the US Gulf of Mexico.
Absolutely.
Andrew, a couple minutes for Q&A, and I'll take the privilege of taking the first couple. Mr. Mayor, in Alaska, I just always like to put this in perspective. How much is a gallon of diesel fuel in your community?
I drive a gas truck, but gallon, I think 7.10 a gallon for unleaded, 7.90 or 8.10 a gallon for diesel. And it varies between the communities. Like I said, we have communities that you can only reach by barge to service for fuel. We have two that you can only reach by air, so they have to get flown in on jets. And those communities are closer to $13 a gallon for diesel, which in those same communities, no natural gas. So you're heating your home and power generating off of diesel.
Off diesel is like going to be $13 a gallon. How much is a gallon of milk in your community?
$12 a gallon, something like that. Pound of ground beef, $10 a gallon. So just let me shoot my
I would
finger,
like to,
man.
I would like to put that in perspective with rural Alaska that, you know, a gallon of milk costs a whole lot more than a gallon of gas, but the gallon of gas is very valuable and very expensive across rural Alaska. We mentioned here, you know, this divide, this, you know, not being able to develop, not, you know, not just, you know, the traditional energy sources, but intermittent renewable stuff because they can't get financing, they can't get to market, transmission. When's it going to break? Like, we're going along here, we're going to hit, you know, like, when is the energy situation in the United States going to break?
Yeah,
I know it's a tough question. I think because it's like you're talking about this, you can't get the infrastructure built, you can't get the energy produced out of the ground, you can't create electrons with power plant. It's
Well, in the electricity space, it's already starting to.
yeah.
It's natural gas and then natural gas and oil. They've still got enough infrastructure and enough of an industry. It's on, you know, it's under attack, but not dead. But in the electricity space, you already have seen the blackouts you see in California, Texas. That is because of 10 years worth of decisions about shutting down reliable generation and promoting unreliable generation. And you even see it with my favorite example is the coal plant outside Kansas City that they're required to stay open in order to apply the electricity to the EV battery plant that they're building.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a very obvious, it's these baseload things are already, they're already getting, in certain RTOs, they're already talking about in the next couple of years, they're talking about not having enough generation capacity. So in the electricity space, at least, it's already here. And yet we have this administration that's pushing even harder on a system that's already creaking.
Yeah, I often wonder if the conversation will change. You know, the decarbonization, especially of the Eastern Seaboard, fundamentally hinges on our ability to build massive amounts of offshore wind. And the targets are indicative of just how much wind needs to be built. They were targeting 30 or 35 gigawatts. Right now, we have about 42 megawatts, right? But that's a 2030 target. And so, maybe it could still happen. I wonder if, as we move forward a year or 2 years, it becomes undeniably obvious to everyone that we are going to fall embarrassingly close of those targets. Maybe something similar for large scale transmission lines. Not, we got half of the way there and we're making progress. Like, oh no, we have barely launched here. Is that when the conversation starts to change?
Well, yeah, but some of these targets are like transmission targets, these offshore wind targets, they're not going to happen.
Yeah. Right.
So at some point, people are going to realize they're not happening.
Yeah.
You know, and it's just the community that's pushing that. Does the Biden administration ever recognize that?
Yeah.
It's
Right.
kind of the question, if and when were they going to recognize that this is not a sustainable federal policy across the board? I want to highlight and recognize Noah Yantis is here, Congressional Western Caucus Executive Director. I'm going to give you a second to shout out. Do you have a question or any thoughts real quick?
No, actually, I was just looking at the House calendar for 2024 that just released. And so maybe each of you or maybe the mayor from Washington can talk about how it's important for lawmakers in Washington to actually get out into districts outside of DC and see how these issues impact, when we pass policies, how constituents are impacted. And then maybe give some word of advice for the staffers and the people watching virtually, kind of like the outlook for next year for Alaskans.
Yeah, I guess I'll just say that, going back to the basic, the basic things in life that, I can fly to DC and take for granted, or I can fly really anywhere and take for granted, that we know at home that we can't, right? And so, I just left home and I was in the middle of working on my addition to my house. And so I cracked open the plumbing, right, to put in the new toilets and tie them into the system. And it's November, mid-November now. And, temperature's probably 15 degrees out. And so things are starting to freeze up and it's like, man, I got to fly to DC to go and do this whole thing. Hopefully my water and sewer doesn't freeze up while I'm gone. And it's stuff like that, at least in my region in Alaska, that we're constantly keeping track of, right? You don't take a vacation, try not to take a vacation more than 10 days unless you got somebody that can watch the house, go flush the toilet, because you're going to pay for it in the long term if everything freezes up. And so I think it's just the basic things that are taken granted. Anything. List can go on, right? And so just keeping that in mind, and I think we're always open to having folks visit and kind of take a look at kind of the bare bones infrastructure that we try to keep alive, and all the more reason that we want to partner with anybody that's interested in investing with us in our region and be a good steward for that, right? So I think there was a second part of the question to that.
I appreciate that. Yeah.
It's what time is it? It's 1 o'clock nap time for Alaska.
Any other thoughts and comment on that? Great. Any last questions from the audience? Well, I'd like to thank everybody. I'd like to thank our panelists. We give them a hand for their. The Western Caucus Foundation will be out in communities across the country, as well as the Congressional Western Caucus, bringing this DC to the community, as well as across the internet. So thank you very much. Reception, get a drink, get a bite to eat before you head out of here. So thank you.
Thanks. Nice to meet you, Mr. Meyer. Welcome.